Hey there, welcome back. It's time to slow down, get comfy, and let the day gently fade away. Tonight, I've got a bedtime story for you. Something calm, gentle, and just right for drifting off to sleep. So tuck yourself in, take a nice deep breath, and let's begin our story together.
Tonight's story takes us to the sunny island of Crete, where a young princess named Ariadne lived in a beautiful palace. But beneath that palace was a secret, a dark and endless maze, so confusing that no one who entered could ever find their way out. When a brave prince named Theseus arrived, determined to face the maze, Ariadne knew she couldn't let him go alone. With nothing more than a single golden thread, she discovered that even the smallest gift can make the biggest difference. This is the story of courage, kindness, and finding your way home. Ariadne and the Golden Thread.
Long ago, on the bright island of Crete, the sea sparkled like glass beneath the sun. The island was alive with olive trees, grapevines, and fields of wildflowers swaying in the breeze. At the very heart of it stood a shining palace, so grand that it seemed to rise straight out of a dream. Inside the palace lived Princess Ariadne. She was known not only for her golden hair that fell in soft waves, but also for her gentle spirit. People said her words were like music, calm, kind, and full of warmth. Whenever Ariadne walked through the gardens, even the birds seemed to sing more sweetly. But there was something in the palace that made her heart heavy. Beneath its stone floors lay a hidden maze, a labyrinth so wide and twisting that no one who entered ever returned. The great builder Daedalus had designed it, and at its center lurked a dark secret, one that the kingdom rarely spoke about. Every year, young men and women from Athens were brought to Crete and sent into that labyrinth. It was a cruel bargain made long ago, and Ariadne often stood on her balcony at dusk, watching the entrance below. The gates looked small from far away, but to her they were heavy with sorrow. She wondered what it must feel like to walk into such darkness, never to see the sky again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sea in shades of gold and rose, news spread through the palace. A new ship had arrived from Athens. Among those on board was a young prince named Theseus. He was brave, determined, and had volunteered to face the labyrinth himself. When Ariadne heard his name, something stirred in her heart. She imagined a young man stepping forward not for glory, but to protect others from suffering. That night, she lay awake beneath the silver glow of the moon, her thoughts restless. She whispered softly to herself, "There must be a way to help him find the path back out." And with that thought, her story and his quietly began.
The morning after the Athenian ship arrived, Ariadne walked out to the palace courtyard. The air smelled of salt and rosemary, carried by the breeze from the sea. From the balcony, she could see the newcomers gathered below, 7 young men and 7 young women who had traveled across the waters to face the labyrinth. Their faces were calm, though she could sense the fear hidden in their eyes. And then she saw him. Theseus stood tall among them, his dark hair catching the light of the sun. His eyes were steady and his shoulders straight, but there was no arrogance in his posture. He didn't look like a prince demanding attention. Instead, He looked like someone carrying a promise, a quiet strength, as if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. Something about him made Ariadne pause. She had seen countless visitors pass through the palace gates, but this young man seemed different. She found herself whispering softly, almost without realizing it. He is not here for himself. That evening, the king held a banquet for the Athenians. The great hall glittered with bronze lamps, and the sound of music echoed across the marble floors. Yet, for all the food and laughter, Ariadne noticed how Theseus barely touched his plate. His gaze kept drifting toward the dark passage that led to the labyrinth below, as if he could already hear the silence waiting for him there. When the banquet ended, Ariadne lingered in the garden, hoping for a moment alone. The moon had risen high, lighting the olive trees with a silver glow. It was there, among the shadows of the garden, that Theseus appeared. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Ariadne broke the silence. "You know, the labyrinth has no end. No one who enters has ever returned." Theseus's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Then it must end with me. If I can stop this sorrow, even if it costs me everything, I will." Ariadne felt her heart ache at his words. She had always believed that courage was noble, but now she wondered if it was also terribly lonely. And for the first time, she wished she could change the fate of someone standing before the labyrinth's gates. That night, as she lay in bed, Ariadne closed her eyes and whispered to the stars, "There must be a way to guide him back into the light."
The palace was never truly quiet at night. Even when the halls were still, Ariadne could hear the wind brushing against the stone walls or the faint call of waves rolling toward the shore. Yet that night felt different. It was as if the entire island was holding its breath, waiting for what would come. Ariadne paced in her chamber, her golden hair loose over her shoulders. She kept thinking about the words Theseus had spoken in the garden. "If I can stop this sorrow, even if it costs me everything, I will." The courage in his voice was clear, but so was the finality. He meant it. He was prepared to never walk out of the labyrinth again. Her heart refused to accept it. There had to be another way. She thought of the countless stories she had heard, of sailors finding their way by starlight, of travelers leaving markers on roads so they wouldn't lose their path. If the maze could not be changed, perhaps the journey inside it could. Then the idea struck her. A thread. A single line, stretched from the entrance, could become a path back home. Simple, fragile, and yet powerful enough to guide someone through the twisting walls. Ariadne hurried to her chest of belongings and pulled out a ball of golden thread, spun fine and strong. It was something she had kept from her weaving, never imagining it might one day hold the weight of someone's life. She held it in her hands and whispered, "May this small gift be enough." The next morning, before the first light touched the palace towers, Ariadne slipped quietly through the halls. She found Theseus in the courtyard, preparing himself with calm determination. He looked surprised when she approached, but also grateful. Without a word at first, she placed the ball of thread in his hands. Then she spoke softly. "This may look small, but follow it and it will lead you back. Tie one end at the entrance and carry the rest with you. Wherever you go, the thread will remember the way." Theseus looked at her, astonishment in his eyes. Slowly, a smile formed, not of victory, but of hope. "You would do this for me?" he asked. Ariadne nodded. "Not just for you, for everyone who has ever walked into darkness, hoping for light." And in that moment,
the fate of the labyrinth began to change.
The day of the trial dawned with a heavy silence. The sky over Crete was pale, almost colorless, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise. From the balcony, Ariadne watched as the chosen Athenians were led toward the great stone gates of the labyrinth. Their steps were slow, their faces pale, but beside them walked Theseus, tall and steady, carrying himself with a calmness that gave the others courage. The entrance to the labyrinth loomed like the mouth of a mountain, its walls dark and cold. Ariadne's breath caught as she saw Theseus pause before stepping inside. From beneath his cloak, he took out the ball of golden thread she had given him the night before. Carefully, he tied one end to the iron gate, pulling the knot tight. Then, with a quiet determination, he carried the rest of the thread in his hand and began his descent. The labyrinth swallowed him quickly. Its passageways twisted left and right, climbing and falling like the inside of a giant's dream. Shadows clung to the walls, and the air was cool and damp. Each step echoed, as if the maze itself were listening. Yet Theseus did not falter. With every turn, he unwound the thread, letting it stretch behind him like a shining path. The golden strand glimmered faintly, a soft reminder of the world outside, of the promise that he would not walk alone. Above, Ariadne stood at the gate, clutching the bars so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could not see him anymore, but she imagined the thread glowing in the darkness, guiding him forward. She whispered prayers into the air, not to the gods, but to the maze itself. Let him return, please let him return. Deep inside, Theseus pressed onward. The walls seemed endless, curling back upon themselves, trying to confuse his mind. But the thread held firm. Every time he looked back, he saw it trailing behind him, steady and true. And with each step, his resolve grew stronger. For in the heart of the labyrinth waited the test that no one had ever overcome. And Theseus, with nothing but his courage and Ariadne's gift, was walking straight toward it. The labyrinth wound deeper and deeper, its walls pressing close, its ceilings stretching high into shadow. For a time, Theseus felt as though he was walking in circles, but whenever he glanced back, the golden thread shimmered faintly, reminding him that the way home was still there, waiting. He moved carefully, listening to the silence. It was not an empty silence. It was the kind that seemed to breathe, as though the maze itself were alive. Now and then he thought he heard faint footsteps echoing far away, but when he turned, there was nothing, only the curve of stone passageways melting into darkness. Meanwhile, above the ground, Ariadne could not tear her eyes from the gate. She sat nearby, refusing food, refusing rest, her gaze fixed on the place where the thread disappeared into the shadows. She pictured Theseus carrying the ball, imagined his strong hands unwinding it with patience. To her, the thread had become more than string. It was hope itself, stretched thin but unbroken. Inside the labyrinth, the air grew colder. Theseus's steps brought him at last to a vast chamber, its floor marked with cracks, its ceiling lost in shadow. The silence here was heavier, like a held breath. He knew he had reached the heart of the maze. He paused, resting his hand on the wall, and whispered to himself, "I am not alone." The golden thread, glowing faintly behind him, seemed to nod in agreement. Theseus did not know what awaited him in the darkness ahead, but he carried with him something stronger than fear. He carried Ariadne's trust and the promise that even in the deepest maze there could be a way home. Far above, as the moon climbed higher, Ariadne felt a sudden warmth, as though the thread itself was humming between them. She pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, "Come back to me, Theseus." The labyrinth held its secrets close, but the thread, small, shining, and steady, stretched on, binding two lives together across the walls of stone. And though the night was heavy, hope quietly flickered, refusing to fade.
Theseus stood still, his breath slow and steady, his ears tuned to the silence of the great chamber. At first, there was nothing, only the echo of his own footsteps fading into the stone. But then, like the faint stirring of wind before a storm, he heard it, a low sound, deep and distant, drifting through the darkness. It was not a voice, nor a song, but a presence. The labyrinth itself seemed to murmur, as though warning him that he had come too far. Theseus tightened his grip on the golden thread, letting its soft glow steady his heart. His heart. "I have come this far," he whispered, "and I will not turn back." The chamber stretched wide before him, the floor uneven, shadows clinging to the edges. Somewhere ahead, beyond the veil of darkness, he knew his greatest trial awaited. Yet he felt no despair. The thread in his hand was light, but it carried the weight of Ariadne's trust, and that trust gave him strength greater than any weapon. Above, Ariadne still kept her vigil. The palace had gone to sleep, yet she remained by the gate of the labyrinth, a lantern resting beside her. Each time the flame flickered, she thought of Theseus, far below, moving through shadows. She touched the loose end of the golden thread tied to the gate and closed her eyes. In her mind, she could almost feel him pulling it gently, step by step, as though they were connected across the winding maze. She thought of his quiet courage, of the way he looked at her, not with pride, but with gratitude. And she prayed that courage and kindness together would be enough to guide him through. Deep inside, Theseus pressed forward. The air grew heavy, and the walls seemed to lean closer, as if the maze itself wished to trap him. Yet with each step, he let the thread slip through his fingers, leaving behind a shining path. For though the shadows whispered of danger, the golden line whispered of hope. And in that quiet, fragile balance between fear and faith, Theseus continued toward the heart of destiny.
The path narrowed, twisting like the coils of a serpent, until suddenly it opened into a chamber larger than any Theseus had seen before. The air was colder here, heavy with silence. The walls stretched upward into shadow, and the ground was cracked as if the earth itself had groaned under the weight of time. For a moment he stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Then, from deep within the chamber, came the sound of breathing, slow, steady, and too large to belong to any man. The echoes rolled across the stone floor, reminding Theseus that this was no empty place. He tightened his hold on the golden thread. Its faint glow steadied him, a line of light connecting him to Ariadne and to the world above. He whispered softly,
I am not alone." The shadows shifted. Though no figure could be seen clearly, the presence in the chamber grew stronger. Some said the labyrinth held a beast at its center. Others said it was a curse born of fear itself. To Theseus, it no longer mattered what form the darkness took. What mattered was that it had stolen countless lives, and now it must end. Above the ground, Ariadne's heart pounded as she sat by the gate. The night stretched on endlessly, the stars wheeling overhead. She pressed her hands together and breathed slowly, as though her calm could reach him where he walked. In her mind, she pictured the golden thread glowing brighter, wrapping him in light as he stepped deeper into danger. In the chamber below, Theseus moved forward, his footsteps sure. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it filled the space around him. Yet even as the darkness pressed in, he carried with him not fear, but purpose. For Ariadne's gift was more than thread. It was faith, it was hope, and with it, Theseus knew he could face whatever the center of the maze demanded of him. He lifted his chin, straightened his shoulders, and whispered one final promise into the shadows. "This ends tonight."
The chamber fell silent once more. The heavy breath that had haunted the labyrinth faded into nothing, leaving only the sound of Theseus's heart pounding in his chest. Slowly he lowered his hands, the echoes of struggle still vibrating in the stone walls. For the first time, the center of the maze felt empty, as though its darkness had been lifted. He stood still for a long moment, breathing in the silence. Then, with a trembling exhale, he looked down at the golden thread still clutched in his palm. Its soft glow had never left him, never broken, even when shadows had pressed hardest against him. "Theseus," he whispered to himself, "the path is waiting." Step by step, he began to follow the thread back. The line stretched across the floor, around corners, through twisting halls that once seemed endless. Where fear had once clouded his mind, now the thread lit the way like a quiet star. Above, Ariadne had not moved from her place beside the gate. Dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky with soft strokes of pink and gold. Her eyes burned from sleeplessness, yet she did not close them. She held the loose end of the thread in her hand, as if holding Theseus himself. And then, faintly, she felt it, the thread tugging. Once, twice, gentle but sure. Her breath caught. "He's coming back," she whispered. "He's really coming back." Minutes stretched like hours as she kept her eyes fixed on the gate. The torches flickered, the wind sighed, and at last, from the shadows of the entrance, a figure began to emerge. At first he was only a shape, dark against the stone. But as he stepped closer, the light of dawn touched his face. It was Theseus. His clothes were torn, his body weary, but his eyes shone with the fire of one who had faced the depths and returned. Ariadne let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears gathered in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of relief. She rose to her feet as he stepped into the light, still holding the golden thread between them, still connected. And in that quiet moment, as the sun rose over Crete, hope had triumphed over fear.
The golden light of dawn spilled across the palace walls as Theseus stepped out of the labyrinth at last. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but in his eyes burned the quiet strength of someone who had walked through darkness and found the way back. Ariadne ran to him, the hem of her gown brushing the stone floor. She did not care who might see, nor what the courtiers would whisper later. For a moment, there was only the thread still stretched between them. fragile, shining, unbroken. "You came back," she breathed, her voice trembling. Theseus smiled faintly, his face pale from fatigue. "I told you, your gift would lead me home." He lifted the golden thread still wound around his hand. "I owe my life to you." Their eyes met, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. It was more than gratitude, more than relief. It was the bond of two souls who had trusted each other in the face of the impossible. Yet even as joy filled Ariadne's heart, a shadow of worry crept in. She knew her father, King Minos, would never forgive what she had done. To give the thread was to betray the labyrinth, and to betray the labyrinth was to defy the crown itself. That evening, as the palace stirred awake with the morning sun, Ariadne and Theseus met once more in the quiet of the garden. The olive trees whispered above them, their silver leaves glowing softly. "You cannot stay here," Ariadne said, her voice steady but heavy with sorrow. "My father will never let you go free." "Then come with me," Theseus answered without hesitation. "Leave this place, leave the shadows of the labyrinth. Together we can find a new life." Ariadne's heart leapt, torn between love for her homeland and the longing for freedom. She had spent years watching the labyrinth consume innocent lives. Now here was a chance to step beyond its walls forever. She reached for his hand, her golden hair catching the first rays of sunlight. "Yes," she whispered, "take me with you." And so, with the sea waiting and the horizon glowing with promise, Ariadne made her choice. For the first time, she stepped not as a princess bound to a palace, but as a traveler beginning a new journey, guided by hope, by love, and by the memory of a single golden thread.
The harbor of Crete shimmered in the morning light. Waves lapped gently against the wooden hulls of ships, carrying with them the salty scent of the open sea. At the far end of the dock, a single vessel waited, its sails pale and ready to catch the rising wind. Ariadne stood beside Theseus, her cloak drawn around her shoulders. For the first time, she felt the island not as her home, but as a memory, a place filled with both beauty and sorrow. The palace towers gleamed behind her, but she did not turn back. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sky touched the water in endless blue. "Theseus," she said softly, "do you think the thread will still matter once we are far from the labyrinth?" He glanced at her, then held up the coil of golden string that he had carefully gathered from the maze. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight. "This thread is more than a guide. It's a reminder that no matter how lost we may feel, there is always a path back if we hold on to hope."
And that's the end of tonight's story. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest maze, a little hope can light the way. Now close your eyes, let the day's worries drift away, and may you fall into the sweetest, most peaceful sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.